Most people assume high heels were designed for women. They weren't. The earliest known high heels date back to 10th century Persia, where male cavalry soldiers wore them to stay secure in their stirrups while shooting arrows from horseback. The raised heel kept their feet from sliding forward in the saddle, giving them greater control during battle. It was purely functional, designed for combat, not fashion. When Persian influence reached Europe in the 16th century, the style caught the eye of the European elite. Aristocratic men, especially those in the courts of France and Italy, adopted the heeled shoe as a symbol of wealth, refinement, and superiority. The logic was simple. If you had heels on, you clearly weren't walking long distances or laboring the fields. High heels became a sign that you were elevated, socially, not just physically. One of the biggest style influences of that era? King Louis XIV of France. He stood just over 5 feet tall, and he leaned into fashion as a form of power projection. His heels were high, lavishly decorated, and dyed red, a color that under royal decree only nobles were allowed to wear. Red heels became a literal mark of privilege. If you wore them, you belonged to the upper crust. But by the late 1600s and into the 1700s, the tide began to shift. High heels gradually began to appear in women's fashion, especially among aristocratic women in France and England. As the style evolved and became more associated with femininity and decorative dress, it quietly fell out of favor with men. Over time, men's footwear shifted toward more practical and understated designs, while heels remained part of women's visual vocabulary, emphasizing posture, elegance, and refinement. For women, heels quickly evolved from status symbols to tools of shaping the body. Quite literally, heels changed posture. Narrow toes, high arches, and rigid soles altered a woman's stance and walk. The gait became shorter, the hips swayed more, and the chest was lifted. It wasn't about practicality, it was about presentation. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, cultural attitudes around fashion began to shift. Influenced by growing interest in science, health, and social reform, many thinkers and designers started promoting what was called rational dress. The idea was simple. Clothing should be more comfortable, more practical, and less about rigid beauty standards. For women, that meant moving away from overly ornate or restrictive styles, including towering heels, in favor of flatter shoes that made everyday movement easier and more natural. By the mid-19th century, heels were making a comeback. This time, it wasn't about royalty or war, it was about image. With the rise of photography, printed media, and consumer advertising, women were increasingly featured in catalogs and magazines. High heels became a visual shorthand for elegance, sophistication, and sex appeal. And then came Hollywood. In the 20th century, heels were elevated, figuratively and literally, into cultural icons. Stars like Marilyn Monroe, Rita Hayworth, and Dorothy Dandridge wore them in films and photo shoots, reinforcing the idea that high heels were glamorous, seductive, and inherently feminine. By the 1950s, engineering caught up to fashion with the invention of the stiletto heel, a tall, thin heel supported by a steel rod. It gave the shoe its signature height and shape, while creating a sleek, almost architectural silhouette. But the cost was never invisible. Heels have long been linked to foot, knee, back, and joint issues. For a long time, there was a quiet belief that beauty required a bit of sacrifice, that to appear elegant, confident, or put together, some level of discomfort was simply part of the package. High heels in particular became both a fashion statement and a silent endurance test, something many women accepted without question, because that's just how it had always been. By the 2010s, something had started to shift, quietly at first, but noticeably. As more people talked about comfort, confidence, and dressing for yourself, women began to look at high heels a little differently. Not with rebellion, but with curiosity. Do I actually like wearing these, or have I just always assumed I should? Some kept reaching for their favorite pair, others let them collect dust at the back of the closet. And just like that, the default started to fade. Then the pandemic hit, and everything slowed down. Suddenly, most of us were working from home, living in sweats, barefoot, or in socks all day. High heels were left behind, not out of protest, just out of practicality. And somewhere along the way, a quiet realization set in. Maybe we never really needed them in the first place. For some, they've stayed part of the routine, a way to feel put together, powerful, and dressed up. For others, they haven't been worn since. And that's the beauty of it. It's up to you. Today, heels aren't a rule, they're a choice. Wear them because you love them, or don't.